Hello Anatomy, welcome to part 2 of our video series on chapter 6, the muscular system. So to remind you, in video 1, we went through the types of muscle cells, went through the anatomy of a muscle cell, how muscle cells contract. In part 2, in this video, we're going to go into a larger scale, into different types of muscle movements, and finally to naming a bunch of muscles. So let's dive right in. So isotonic versus isometric contractions. So this is an important distinction. So we said in video 1 that what muscles do is they contract, they shorten. An isotonic contraction would be when a muscle cell is tense, when it's contracting, and a bone is actually moving. So the movements that you're familiar with, bending your knee, rotating your arm, moving your joints, those are isotonic because the filaments actually slide past one another and the muscle contracts and bones move. Isometric would be when there's tension in the muscle, but it's not actually moving. So imagine you were putting your hand up against a wall and just pushing the wall. You're not moving, the wall's not moving, nothing is moving, but the muscle's still contracting. But there's no shortening of the muscle. So again, push a wall with bent elbows, the muscle is still tense, but it's not shortening. We mentioned the two types of contractions because it gets into the different types of muscle movements. So aerobic exercises, these are things like running, jogging, doing Zumba, whatever you guys do nowadays, dancing. These are exercises that build up endurance, where you're moving the muscles a lot, lots of free movement amongst your joints. This is good for you because it makes the muscles more efficient, increases blood flow to the muscles, also improves your digestion. It basically makes your muscular system work better. Those kind of exercises are not going to make your muscles get that much bigger. They're just going to make them work more efficiently. Resistance exercises, things like that are isometric. So imagine like you're doing the bench press. You lift the bar halfway up and you just hold it there. The muscle's not shortening, but it's definitely working. Those kind of exercises do not, they don't increase your endurance. If you want to, run a marathon and you're just doing weight training, that's not going to be good for prepping for a marathon. But they do increase the muscle size and the muscle strength. So aerobic exercises, things that are isometric, makes the muscles more efficient, but it doesn't really make them that much bigger. Resistance exercises, isometric exercises, things like weight training, make the muscles bigger, stronger, but they don't really increase your endurance. Obviously, a good workout regimen, you would use some of both. So this is a great picture, right? So this guy is running a race. These would be, going back, these would be isotonic exercises, aerobic exercises. This gentleman is doing weight training. Obviously, he has some pretty significant muscles. These would be, going back, these would be the isometric exercises that are making the muscles larger and stronger, but not that much in terms of increasing the endurance. So now we're going to get through the way muscles work and move, and this leads us to naming muscles. And this can get pretty dense. So let's just go through this slowly. So there's 5 what are called golden rules for skeletal muscle activity, and let me just read them to you and just discuss them briefly. So number 1, with a few exceptions, all skeletal muscles cross at least one joint. So think about what your biceps do. Your biceps flex your arm. They move your forearm toward you, right? Those muscles are crossing your elbow joint, all right? Sometimes muscles can cross more than one joint, but they almost always cross at least one joint. Number 2, typically the bulk of a skeletal muscle lies proximal to the joint crossed. So proximal would be closer to the origin of the limb. So like your bicep, most of the bulk of that muscle is going to lie toward your shoulder, not so much toward your elbow, right? Number 3, all skeletal muscles have at least 2 attachments, the origin and the insertion. Let me show you a quick picture. So this again is showing your biceps. So there's 2 attachment points. There's an origin and there's an insertion. So usually the origin is proximal. It's closer to where the limb attaches to your torso, and the insertion is further away. So think of it this way: when you're flexing your bicep, the origin is not moving. The insertion is moving. So the origin is usually the immovable attachment, and the insertion is the movable attachment. So basically, you move the insertion toward the origin. All right. Number 4, skeletal muscles can only pull, they can never push. You know, muscles contract, they create tension. You know, if you're pushing against something, you know, you could be pushing, but what the muscles that are doing that make you push, those muscles are pulling, they're contracting. And number 5, during contraction of skeletal muscle, insertion moves toward the origin. That's what we just said using this diagram. The insertion moves toward the origin. All right. These 5 rules are very useful to have in the back of your head when, you know, we're going through the different muscle movements and how you name muscles. We already said this. Movement is attained due to a muscle moving an attached bone. So the origin is the part that's immovable. So with your bicep, the origin is on your humerus. The insertions on the radius or the ulna, depending upon the muscle that you're talking about, that would be the insertion, the attachment to a movable bone. Okay, we already saw this diagram. So, you know, make sure in your head this diagram makes sense in terms of the terms origin and insertion. Okay, types of body movement. So this is pretty simple, but there's a bunch of them. So let's just go through them one at a time. So flexion versus extension. Flexion and extension are opposites. Flexing a joint is decreasing the angle of that joint. So if I said to flex your elbow, this is flexing your elbow because I'm decreasing the angle of that joint. Typically, it brings 2 bones closer together. They're typical with things like hinge joints, like your knee, ball and socket joints, like your hip. If I said to flex your knee, obviously you can't see my knee right now, but flexing your knee would be bringing your lower leg up under your behind. All right. Before you kick a soccer ball, when you sort of bring your leg back, that's flexing your knee. When you actually kick the soccer ball, that's extending your knee. With your elbow, this is flexing your elbow. This is extending your elbow. All right. Like I just said, extension is the opposite of flexion. It typically increases the angle of 2 joints, like straightening your elbow or your knee. If you extend your forearm more than 180 degrees, that's called hyperextension. Let's do another one. If I said to flex your neck, so flexing your neck, think to yourself what that would look like. Flexing decreases an angle, so flexing your neck is looking downward. Extending your neck is looking upward. All right, and I can hyperextend my neck because I can go past 180 degrees. So this is flexing your neck. That's extending your neck. So here you can just see examples of flexion, and here's, here you're flexing your knee, here you're extending your knee. Hyperextension, like with your arm, is going past 180 degrees. Okay. Again, with your head, flexion, extension, hyperextension. So rotation, this, shaking your head, no, don't do that. That's rotating your head. It's common in ball and socket joints. This is when you're moving a bone or a series of bones around the longitudinal axis, like you're shaking your head no. That's a rotation. You can rotate your legs too. You can rotate your legs, around, the up and down axis, the sagittal plane, I guess you could say. So abduction versus adduction, these are also opposites. To abduct something means to move it away from the midline. To adduct something means to move it toward the midline. So if I said I wanted you to abduct your arm, you would move it up like that. To adduct your arm, you move it down under, under the plane of your body. If you abduct a child, you take it away from its parents. To anything, to abduct is to take away. To adduct is to move it toward. Circumduct is just a combination of all of them. If you circumduct your arm, you hold it outright and you make a circle with your fingers. That's to circumduct, and it's a combination of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, and they're common in ball and socket joints like your shoulder. So dorsiflexion versus plantar flexion. So these both involve your feet. So dorsiflexion, if you curl your toes upward, like flex your foot so it's going toward the ceiling, lifting your foot. That's called a dorsiflexion. All right, pulling your toes toward your shin. A plantar flexion would be pointing your toes, depressing your foot down, pointing your toes toward the sole. When you do a plantar flexion, like if you put your hand on your calf muscle, which I'm doing right now, like if you're doing the like raising your body with your calf muscle, that's a plantar flexion, right? Actually, no, that's dorsiflexion. Lifting your toes upward, like put your hand on your calf muscle, lift your toes upward, and you can feel your calf muscle is flexing. Moving it downward, doing a plantar flexion, you can feel your calf muscle feels kind of flabby when you do that because you're not flexing the muscle when you're doing a plantar flexion. So inversion versus eversion, this is pretty simple. This just involves your foot. An inversion of your foot means kind of like sweep your sole toward the middle, toward the median plane, inward. Eversion with an E means you sweep your foot outward. So like the bottom of your foot's pointing outward when you do an eversion, it's pointing inward when you do an inversion. Supination versus pronation. So, you know, if you're lying on your back, if you're like totally asleep, you're on your back with your palms upward, that's called a supine position. So supination, so, you know, you can do your arm like this number, moving your arm so the palms face outward, that's called supination. When you do a supination, your radius and your ulna are parallel. So that's a supination. A pronation is when you move your arm so that the back of your palm, back of your hand faces outward. That is a pronated configuration. If you look at this diagram, when you're doing a supination, the radius and the ulna are parallel. When you're doing a pronation, again, when the back of your hand faces forward, the radius and the ulna actually cross and form like an X. So this is the supination form, the parallel. This is pronation, and the radius and the ulna are actually crossing, like you can see in this diagram. Opposition, this is simple. Just taking your thumb and touching it to each of your fingers, that's called opposition. On the same hand, obviously. So now we're going to get into types of muscles. So we discussed this very, very briefly on the last diagram. So prime mover, antagonist, synergist, and fixator. So, you know, muscles do lots of things besides just move. All right, they might stabilize your posture, they can stabilize a joint. Prime movers are muscles that are doing a big movement. You know, if I flex my elbow like that, that's your biceps. Your biceps are definitely prime movers. An antagonist does the opposite of what a prime mover does. So the antagonists for your biceps are your triceps. So put your hand on your biceps and flex your elbow, you can feel it. Now extend your elbow, you can feel your triceps are contracting. A synergist is a muscle that helps a prime mover, not to actually do the movement, but it helps like prevent rotation of or movement of other muscles. I said in video 1, the muscles that flex your fingers also cross your wrist. So, you know, if I do all of them, you're doing that number. I can flex my fingers and keeping my wrist stabilized. So there's synergist muscles that help stabilize this joint, so I can do this number. And actually, I can feel them when I do this without actually moving my wrist. Otherwise, you couldn't move fingers without moving your wrist also. A fixator is a type of synergist. There's things like in your knees or your shoulders that help stabilize the origin. You know, when a muscle moves, the insertion moves towards the origin. But sometimes the origin might be moving too because you're putting pressure on it. A fixator prevents the origin from moving when the insertion is moving, okay? Let me go back real quick to this diagram. So, you know, you can imagine when this muscle contracts, you know, your forearm moves toward your humerus. Well, why doesn't the humerus, like, why don't your shoulders like hunch forward when you do that, right? Why isn't it like a that number? Well, because you have synergist muscles and fixators that help keep the origin stabilized while the insertion is moving. Okay, let's go back where we were. Okay, so naming skeletal muscles, you know, these have all kinds of wonky names. So just some general trends. So the direction of muscle fibers, rectus in Latin means straight. So the muscle fibers are going straight up and down, like the abdominis rectus, or I'm sorry, the rectus abdominis in your abs, which we'll get to in a minute. Relative size, maximus versus minimus. Maximus obviously is bigger, minimus is smaller. The location, your temporalis muscle attaches to your temporal bone, so that might tell you sort of where it is. The number of origins, so sometimes muscles could attach to a bone in more than one spot. If there's 2 origins, the biceps has 2 origins, there's 2 heads of that muscle. The triceps have 3 origins, there's 3 heads of that muscle. The name might indicate that, bi versus tri. The location, so a muscle that has sterno in it probably attaches to your sternum. The shape, the deltoid muscle, like of your shoulder shape, kind of like a triangle, like a delta shape. The action, flexor or extensor. This one's very useful because we know that a flexor flexes a muscle or a bone, an extender straightens it out. So if the name is, if flexor or extensor is in the name, it tells you what the muscle's doing. Those are very, very helpful clues. Okay, so now we're going to get into naming actual muscles. So, muscles have shapes. They can be circular like this, the muscles that pucker your lips. A muscle like your pecs, your pectoralis major, it's a convergent muscle because it actually all converges into one spot on the tendon. Fusiform, this is kind of like the shape of an airplane. You have like where the people are, that's a fusiform shape, like your biceps. Sartorius or long, thin muscles, they're parallel. Multi versus bipinnate, so like the pectoralis has 1 origin. This is part of your quadriceps in your leg. So it has two main tendons. It's bipinnate. Here you have multipinnate. You can see there's like the little thin connective tissue layers here. Unipinnate. So here I have all the muscles are attaching to this one either tendon or aponeurosis, whatever it is. It's called unipinnate. Okay. So let's get into some muscles. So as we go through this, I'm kind of go back and forth a little bit to some diagrams. And I also want, as we're doing this, I want you to actually feel what the muscles feel like. So if I say, touch your cheeks and smile, that's so that you can feel where the muscles are to help you learn them. So the frontalis, put your head here, raise your eyebrows. That's the frontalis muscle. It raises your eyebrows, makes you look surprised. In this diagram, they're right there, right? No surprise there. The orbicularis oculi, close your eyes. Those muscles are right here. They're the circular ones. Close your eyes, squint, blink. That's pretty simple. The orbicularis oris closes your mouth or protrudes your lips like you're going to pucker. Those would be the circular muscles around your mouth right here. The buccinator is the main chewing muscle. So act like you're chewing. It flattens your cheeks or closes your jaw, so you're chewing. The buccinator is right here. Zygomaticus, smile, raise the corners of your mouth. All right, put your fingers on your cheekbones and smile. You can feel that's the zygomaticus muscle, which is right here, which raises the corners of your mouth. And lastly, the chewing muscles, the masseter is again an important muscle for chewing, closes the jaw and elevates the mandible. Now, put your hands on your temporal bone here and chew. You can feel there's a muscle in your temple when you're raising your jaw that's flexing too. It's a synergist of the masseter. It works with it and it closes your jaw. And here's the temporalis. And here's the masseter. All right, they're both involved in chewing. Okay? Okay, so muscles of your neck, the platysma and the sternocleidomastoid. So let me show you where they are. So the platysma is sort of on the front of your neck right here. The sternocleidomastoid is right here. The name here, the sternocleidomastoid, the name kind of gives it away because it attaches to your sternum and your clavicle, and then it attaches to the mastoid process of your that's the one that's the back of your sort of temporal bone, I think. Flexing the neck is doing this number. So put your hand here and flex your neck. You can feel the muscles contracting. Rotating your head, that number, you can feel it's involved in that too. The platysma is the frowning muscle. Put your hands on the front of your neck and frown, and you can feel those are flexing. That's the platysma right here. It's a very, very long, broad, but very, very thin muscle. Okay, so I think we've done all the ones on this particular diagram. Lots of muscles in the face. Okay, so the muscles of your trunk, arm, and shoulder. So these are ones a lot of these you're familiar with. So again, we're going to talk about what they do and then show you a diagram. So pectoralis major are your pectoral muscles. Adducting your arm is bringing it in line. So put your hand on your pecs and bring your arm down, and you can feel that's adducting the humerus. Flexing the humerus would be doing this. No, flexing the humerus would be bringing it down. And you can feel, bring your arm down, you can feel that muscle is contracting. Your pectoralis major, again, are right here. Most people are familiar with pecs. So intercostal muscles, these are muscles between your ribs. These are involved in inflating and deflating your lungs. The external intercostals raise your rib cage during inhalation, and the internal intercostals depress your your rib cage when you're exhaling. And the intercostal muscles, they're not shown much on this diagram, but you can see they're sort of here. Okay. All right, so where were we? We did pectoralis, we did intercostals. Here's your pecs. So the muscles of your abdominal girdle, these are your abs. This is when you want the 6-pack or 8-pack or whatever. So the names, rectus abdominis, external oblique, internal oblique, and transverse abdominis. So when you look at a picture, so you can see, like here, your rectus abdominis, they're in a straight line. The internal and external obliques kind of go at an angle. See how right there is an angle? And your transverse abdominis is, like if your rectus abdominis is going up and down, see the fibers go up and down? Here they're going side to side, all right? And what your abs do, collectively would be to flex your vertebral column, which is to bend over at your back. Flexing your backbone would be to do this number. So if you're forcing yourself to breathe, if you're in childbirth, if you're defecating, if you're, on the toilet and you're, compressing your abdominal contents to go to the bathroom, that's your abs. External obliques also flex your vertebral column, but you can also you can go forward or you can kind of go side to side a little bit. Those are because of your external and your internal obliques. Your transverse abdominis, like I say, compress the abdominal contents, which would be if you're having a baby or forcing yourself to breathe, or if you're going to the bathroom. All right, this picture shows all of them. And you can see the most superficial are the rectus abdominis. This would be having a 6-pack, right? The obliques and the transverse abdominis are deep to the rectus abdominis. Okay, the muscles of your trunk, your shoulder, and your arm. So on your back, so the trapezius and your latissimus dorsi, quick picture. So here your trapezius, this kind of triangle-shaped muscle. Your latissimus dorsi or your lats are beneath them. These are muscles, people who are competitive swimmers, these muscles are used a lot. The trapezius basically is focused around your shoulder blade. The things at the gym, the pull down thing. If you're a trapeze artist or if you're swimming and you're moving your arms a lot, right? Those would depress, adduct, or stabilize the scapula, your shoulder blade. Your lats, your latissimus dorsi, extends and adducts the humerus. So again, that's bringing the humerus back in line. If you're doing a stroke, that's part of a stroke, right? That's your lats. The erector spinae or spinae, so back extension would be like, so this is back flexion. Back extension would be like increasing your posture, extending your back. The quadratus lumborum, flexing the spine laterally, would be, doing this number, going back and forth a little bit. Obviously, you don't have a huge range of motion there, but you can flex your spine side to side a little bit. The deltoid is the triangular muscle in your arm. The deltoid abducts your arm, so it moves it away from the body plane. So looking at a diagram, here's your deltoid, right? Here's your trapezius, and here's your lats, the latissimus dorsi. And again, this one shows the triceps too, which would be to, extending your elbow is your triceps. Okay, same picture, just bigger. Here you can see the erector spinae. These are the ones that cause your back to extend. They're very long, thin muscles. So muscles of the upper limb. So these are ones you're familiar with. So your biceps brachii, putting your forearm into the supine position where your palm faces outwards, your biceps do that. So, put your palm outward, put your hand on your bicep and do that number. Like that, you can feel your bicep contracts. Flexing your elbow again is doing that number. Your brachialis is also for elbow flexion. It's not quite as strong as the biceps. It's deep to the biceps. The brachioradialis is a pretty weak muscle. That's one that you can see. It's in your forearm. Tennis is a good sport to help build your brachioradialis. Typically, it's not a particularly strong muscle. It also, like the biceps, does elbow flexion. The triceps, again, this is the antagonist to the biceps. If your biceps flex your elbow, your triceps extend your elbow. Okay, here you can just see the different muscles of your arm. Okay, I think we've already gone through all these, haven't we? We have, just a different diagram. Okay, muscles of your upper limb, of your wrist and your fingers. So actually, should that be lower limb? Upper limb's up here. Well, these are the muscles of your wrist and your fingers. So the names give it away. Flexor carpi. Carpi refers to your carpals. That flexes your wrist. So flexing your wrist is doing that number. That's flexing your wrist. Extending your wrist are the extensor carpi or carpi, and that's that number, right? Flexor digitorum would be finger flexion, which is making a fist. Extensor digitorum would be finger extension, which is straightening out your fingers. Okay, the names totally give away what these muscles do. Muscles of the lower limb. Oh, I see. I was calling it upper limb in terms of your arm. Okay, it wasn't a mistake. I get it now. Muscles of your lower limb, so these would be of your leg. So these are muscles that might have movement at your hip joint, at your thigh, or at your knee. So gluteus maximus, that's your tush. That's doing squats gives you good glutes. That's hip extension. So hip extension. So right now I'm sitting down. If I stand up, right, that's moving my hip, so it's under my torso, right? Right now I'm sitting. Right now my legs come out from my torso. Stand up, that's extending your hip. All right. Flexing your hip would be, when you're going down into a squat position, that's flexing your hip. When you're coming up into a squat position or leaving the squat position, standing upright, that would be hip extension. Like I say, squats give you good glutes, right? Gluteus medius is for hip abduction. That would be moving your hip away from the body plane. The gluteus medius, again, here's the maximus, here's the medius, is a muscle that, when you're walking, your pelvis doesn't just go crazy. You can walk and keep your pelvis steady. That's what the gluteus medius does. The iliopsoas, the P is silent in this muscle. It's for hip flexion. It isn't on this picture. The iliopsoas is on right here. It's on this picture right here, kind of in this area of your body. So the iliopsoas is for hip flexion. That would be for flexing your hip, for moving your hip. It's kind of like hip abduction, moving your hip away from the body plane. When you're standing or when you're walking or you're just standing erect, your upper body doesn't fall backwards. Your upper body is stabilized, and your iliopsoas do that. The abductor muscles do just what it said. They abduct your thigh, which would be like to bring your thighs together, all right, to sort of compress your thighs. At the gym, there's the abductor, the abductor machine. Abductor moves your legs apart. The adductor machine brings them in line. Okay. All right, cool. So this picture just shows you your gluteus maximus is or even the gluteus medius are common sites for injections. This isn't that important, but the sciatic nerve that runs down your leg, if I give you a shot and it hits the sciatic nerve, that's going to be very, very painful. So usually you make sure you do it in this upper right quadrant right here, of the gluteus maximus or the gluteus medius. We'll come back to all that. Actually, have we? Yeah, we did all those. So good. Okay, so muscles of the lower limb at the knee. So the hamstrings. So the hamstrings are, the back of your thigh. So thigh extension and knee flexion. So, your hamstrings, the biceps femoris, these muscles, you don't need to know the different names for the hamstrings. You can just collectively call them the hamstrings. Thigh extension and knee flexion. So flexing your knee So before you kick the soccer ball, when you bend your knee back, put your hand on your hamstrings and bend your knee back. That's knee flexion. Thigh extension would be like if I stand up, right? Extending my thigh would be bringing my thighs straight up line with the body plane. All right, hamstrings do that. And your hamstrings, again, that they look like strings almost. People butchers that slaughter pigs, and they'll hang pigs or cows up by their hamstrings. That's why they're called hamstrings. Well, if it's ham, it's a pig, right? The sartorius and the quadriceps. So these would be the muscles of the front of your leg. There are 4 different muscles in your quadriceps. This picture only shows 3 of them: the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, and the vastus medialis. There's a 4th one that's deep that isn't in this picture. Your quadriceps would be extending your knee. So, you're going to kick the ball. Flexing your knee is when you pull your leg back. Extending your knee is when you actually kick the ball and straighten out your leg. The sartorius is this long, thin muscle right here that flexes the thigh. The sartorius is the most superficial of the muscles of your leg. It's the one that you can see the easiest. The sartorius is going to be a muscle that flexes your thigh. Okay, so muscles of the lower limb. These would be ones around your ankle or your foot. The tibialis anterior would be on the front of your lower leg, basically your shin. So put your hand on your shin and then do dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion is pointing your toes upward. All right, so put your hand on your shin and then point your toes upward. You can feel there's a muscle there that's contracting. Foot inversion is sweeping your foot on the inside, like sweep the bottom of your foot toward the inside of your body. That's foot inversion. Extensor digitorum longus is toe extension. That's just pointing your toes upward. Dorsiflexion is pointing your whole foot upward. That's kind of talking about the same thing. The fibularis muscles, the fibularis muscles. So plantar flexion is pointing your toes downward. Well, I can't talk. The fibularis muscles, plantar flexion is pointing your toes downward. All right. Foot eversion would be sweeping your foot, so it faces the outside of your body. All right. The soleus muscle, plantar flexion, again, that's pointing your toes downward. The gastrocnemius is also plantar flexion. These 2 are mainly what the muscles of your calf. All right. Put your hands in the back of your leg where your calf muscle is. Point your toes downward. Right. You can totally feel your calf muscles, the soleus and the gastrocnemius muscles of your calf. Again, that's right here. The soleus is lower. The gastrocnemius, when you're doing that, when you feel your calf, that's the gastrocnemius muscle. The soleus is, posterior to that. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. So these last 2 diagrams that you have go through all the muscles. The ones that you would need to know for a diagram for a test, we'll talk about in class. But basically, we've gone through the vast majority of this diagram, the anterior side and the posterior side. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. That was definitely a lot for one video, and I will see you guys next time.